Hey everyone, National Master Sean Lei here. In today's chess video, we're going to be looking at my 4th round game against the Jomo Kenyetta University of Agriculture and Technology game at the Kasparov Foundation Chess University Cup. Let's get straight into it. Alright, so in this game over here, my opponent was not as strong as my last opponent, obviously. As you guys know, my last game was against a Grandmaster, and it was a close game, and I was even better playing my Philidor. But in the end, it just didn't pan out. You can check out that video over there. But for this game over here, again, I'm playing against a weaker opponent, so I started off with e4. Now you might be thinking, Sean, that's weird. How come you play d3, d6 openings against stronger opponents, and you play e4 against weaker opponents? Well, the reason why is because against stronger opponents, my opponents know how to play e4 better than me, so I'm going to play something they don't know, and against weaker opponents, I'm going to know how to play e4 better than them, so I'll play this instead. They played e5, knight f3, and my opponent plays knight f6, and I start to sleep, I start to snore, Petrov defense. And I think to myself, I could go into, some Nimzovich attack over here, but I know I'm not too familiar with these lines. I know they're pretty good for white, but I'm not too sure I want to go into this because who knows, maybe my opponent knows this better than me. And so knowing that, I thought to myself, you know what? What do I know better than my opponent? And I thought to myself, wait a second, what if I just transpose this into, guess what? A reverse white Philidor, or kind of a King's Indian. And it depends on how you think about it. But the planning I go for in this position kind of relates to the Philidor, so let's just call it the line defense or Philidor defense. d6, knight bd2, my opponent plays knight bd7, and I decide to put my bishop on e2. My opponent decides to put the bishop on g7. Now, this comes the first symmetrical difference in our position. He's putting his bishop here, I'm putting the bishop on e2. We'll see whose bishop is better placed in the future. You might think that the bishop on g7 is obviously better because it's fianchettoed, but I would like to disagree. We'll see what we do with our bishops in the future. Castle, bishop g7, put my rook on e1, they castle, and I put my bishop on f1. Now you might be confused, why to put my bishop here only to put it back? Well, because it's more flexible. And flexibility is very important when it comes to a chess game. Why? Because, well, sometimes I might want to put it here. I don't know yet. Maybe the bishop wants to stay on this diagonal. I don't know yet either. That's why I'm doing this. Opponent plays rook e8. And I decide to play c3. As you guys know, c3 is probably one of my favorite moves in chess because it allows me to play b4 or d4. My opponent doesn't know. b4 allows me to play the crab defense. My opponent copies me. I play b4. And as you can see, it's very symmetrical. Only difference is the bishop on f1 and the bishop on g7. And my opponent plays d5. Now here's a good question for you guys. I want you guys to think about this yourself. Would you A, capture, or would you B, ignore the pawn? I want you guys to think about this. Take a second or two. And the answer is, well, you don't capture. Capturing gives your opponent a position that they want. Now you have some weird pawn structure over here, and you don't have a central pawn, or your opponent has a pretty good center over here. So you want to keep the tension in the center. As Lasker once said, to take is a mistake, and you don't want to be one taking. My opponent, unfortunately for him, didn't learn about this, so when I played bishop b2 developing a piece, he took me. Got relieved pressure, I'm happy now. I captured back, and again, you can see how my bishop is kind of good in this position. It's doing quite a bit on this diagonal, while this bishop is still very useless. In fact, this bishop will want to hope it was on f8. Hopes it's on f8 instead of wasting 2 moves to get it to this useless square. And here, I want you guys to start thinking. Alright, after my opponent plays c5, which is definitely a terrible garbage move, I want you guys to think about where your opponent's potentially weak. Is there any weak squares you can attack? Is there any way that you can, begin an onslaught against your opponent's pieces? So if you think about this for a bit, I think to myself, well, first of all, I don't want to capture here because the same principle still lies. To take is a mistake. If I take, my bishop is sad, my pawn on c3 is sad. Obviously taking is a silly mistake. Maybe I want to play rook c1, but rook c1 kind of bad if he doesn't take me. If he's good, he won't take me. So I think to myself, oh, wait a second. The bishop's on g7, it's not on f8. The dark squares are weak over here. Huh. And if the dark squares are weak, especially this guy over here, since no pawns can guard it, why don't I just go and take advantage of that? And so I play knight to c4, just saying, hey, your d6 square is weak. Let's just take advantage of it. He captures, which again is terrible. It just unleashes my bishop, allows me to gain more space on the queen side, and potentially rook can go on c1. I don't know. I think these two moves were the reason why he lost, capturing here and capturing there. Keep up the tension. I know it can be difficult at times. I know you might get worried, but keeping up the tension 99% of the times, it's better than, just giving your opponent what they want. My opponent plays queen c7, and here I decided to play up a couple moves that help me just gain a couple of tempos for free. I played here, attacking the rook. He moves up. I gain a tempo attacking the queen. The queen moves back to where it was, and then I attack the rook, and it goes back to where it was. So literally look at this position. I literally improved my position from having my knight here and here to basically getting my knights over here, here, and here without losing any tempos. Literally the opponent's position is the same as it was 2 moves ago, except now I have very good pieces. My opponent plays rook f8. I want you guys to pause the videos, try to find a way to already win a huge material. This happens when your opponent has both light square and dark square weaknesses here. This bishop wants to be here, this bishop cannot see outside. Alright, hopefully I gave you guys ample enough time to basically calculate, but there's a couple moves that I find here. If you play bishop c4, that's good. I decided to just capture on f7 with the knight, and funnily enough, after bishop c4, the rook is pinned and there's actually no good way to defend it. It's actually very funny, because usually when you have like 5 pieces around, there's a way to defend, but since the pieces are all blocking each other, there's actually no way. And so I win the rook. My opponent plays queen e7, and though this was probably possible taking on h6 check, double checking win on a pawn, I thought to myself, I'm up an exchange, I'm up a pawn. Let's just simplify things. My golden rule, you guys all know. When I'm up material, I just like to take things slowly. Why give my opponent compensation? So I just play queen d6. Hey, if we trade off queens, that's good for me. And yeah, I don't win another pawn, but you don't want to win too many pawns, because that gives your opponent hope, and that's the worst thing you can do. He takes, I take back. He plays king h7, and I just play bishop e6. Why? Because I just say, hey, let's just trade off more pieces. How are you going to get out of this? So we just trade literally every piece in the game. And here, I want you guys to think, would you play a move like pawn a3, or is there another move you would play? I know a couple of you guys might have played a3 in this position, because, they attack my b4 pawn, but I realized, even if he takes the b4 pawn, it doesn't really matter. What matters is him maybe getting this open c-file, even though in the long term, if you calculate, probably it doesn't amount to much. But why give him the hope? So I just say, hey, take my b pawn, I don't care. And even if he did, there's a tactic here that wins the game again. It's just rook c7. The knight is pinned, cannot move. So he can't even take the pawn anyways. Knight f6. I decide to defend my pawn. No need to exchange pawns. One thing, a common misconception that people think is that when you're up material, you want to trade pawns. No. You want to trade pieces. Pawns are not pieces, they're pawns. So don't trade pawns, because pawns are easier to promote the more pieces you have. The less pawns you have, well, the more you're going to have to rely on your pieces, right? That's not something you want. So I could have taken here and, probably called it a day, but I was like, you know what, let's just defend stuff. He takes there, I take on e5, and in this position, I ended my opponent by checking. The king moves here, instead of taking on the b pawn. I know a couple people might have taken on more pawns, but this kind of proves my point. Like here, I know a couple people might be too greedy, and then all of a sudden you lose your rook, and even though this position is still winning for white, it's going to be a lot more difficult, and you don't want to complicate things like that. Instead, I realized, you know what? How do I force my opponent to resign? I realized the knight is very trapped, can't go to any of these squares. g4, my opponent resigned. There's nothing they can do to protect the knight. So I think this was a pretty well played game by me. I mean, it wasn't too complex. I just played a backwards Philidor. My opponent just took a little bit too many times and created too many dark square, light square weaknesses. And like this turtle that I like to call this opening, I snapped when I needed to, and my opponent collapsed. So if you guys have any questions about the anti-Philidor or the reverse Philidor or Philidor line or whatever you want to call this opening, tell me in the comment section below. I'll be happy to answer your questions. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. Help my channel quite a bit. Alright guys, I'll see you guys in the next video. Toodaloo.